Okay. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. I don't think the microphone's working. Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us. We'll get the microphone set up. Just one thing to our board members, if you're able to use your microphone when speaking, that was a request following our last meeting set up like this when we're all spread out with mics. Try it. Good. Thank you. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is a budget finance committee meeting with no plan for action, but setting the stage for the details of the 25-26 budget. I'll start with, there are so many variables that are involved at different stages. And, so working through it, I'll do my best to make sure that it all makes sense in the place that it does throughout the presentation, but there will be an opportunity for questions, first from the board, then from our public guests. First, the factors leading up to our 25-26 budget challenges, they don't change a whole lot from year to year with the exception of the details. And we do say there was 9 consecutive years without a tax increase before 24-25. Obviously, during each of those years, the budget was tightened in response to the burden of natural inflationary costs of supplies, services, salaries, benefits, etc. So in those years, there was a lot of work done to continue to reduce the annual increases that would have occurred without that work. Our annual salary increases of about $700,000. That's for all categories. So we begin each year with a deficit, partially because of the next one. The corporate tax assessment appeals in recent years have driven negative overall assessed values throughout the district. At the current millage, Quincentenary School District received $18,000 less from local taxes than we did in this year, 24-25 and 25-26. Traditionally, we've averaged over the last 10 years or so approximately, give or take, 1% of increase every year in overall assessed value. And given the same millage, and that changes a little bit by year to year, that would amount to about $200,000 more a year if we went up 1% in overall assessed value this year as a result of the accumulation of assessment appeals that started with one large one, and now have accumulated through other small ones. We're actually projecting less revenue for 25-26 and 24-25. In addition, in the absence of cyber charter funding reform, which we talked about last meeting, and we'll touch on a little bit here. Last year, in the absence of that reform, last year there was something called the transition fund through the state, where we received $107,000 of state funding in that transition fund. In the governor's proposal, the transition fund was not being funded with this proposal for cyber charter funding reform. So currently, in the absence of the reform, we are set to receive less money from the state fund. And so you have annual cost increases, and 70% of our revenue comes from local taxes. We're set to receive less in local taxes. And our second largest revenue source, state funding. We are set to receive less in state funding as well. And then we face these increased costs to charter schools and cyber charter schools. Of note is cyber charter, which again, we'll talk about some of the reform efforts and some optimism, at least from the person standing here, that we'll see some change this year. Just to talk about referendum a little bit, this is a word that we haven't used in the past, really. The referendum and just a brief story of the referendum. Again, we have that percentage there of 10.629%, 97%, pardon me. Act 1 limits the board's ability to increase taxes annually. There's a Act 1 index that is set annually based off of several years of rolling averages of increased costs across the state and then regionally here in Kutztown. The current Act 1 index for us is 4%, and the board has the authority to raise taxes to 4%. We also have the opportunity to apply for exceptions to the Pennsylvania Department of Education. In certain instances, there's a variety of categories. The only one which we currently qualify, we believe, is special education. So therefore, we have not heard back from the state yet. We expect to have an answer from the state probably in the next week or so, whether we are eligible for that additional 1.0183%. Anything above that, either the 4 or the 4 plus 1.0183 requires a referendum. Timelines for budgeting is really, really challenging. We know we likely won't see a state budget until the end of June or July. Our budget is due in June. And as we'll talk about here today, many factors that impact the budget will kind of play out over the course of that time. Some of them very large that may never play out, and some of them they're a little bit smaller. That being said, the board must approve and then send to the Berks Board of Elections a question for referendum by March 21st. So you see how those timelines don't work, right? It's really challenging to see all those pieces come together. So knowing the challenging decisions and several unresolved budgetary figures would remain on March 21st, the board voted to put the full known increase to the public or vote on May 20th. When we last met, it was February 24th. So the number from February 24th changed between then and March 17th. And I wanted to kind of highlight where those changes occurred. Remembering some of those assumptions in the February 24th presentation, it was assuming a 4% tax increase, which is was the actual index. It also assumed kind of the historical increases in other areas, including for this year, historical and some known or projected, including this year for health insurance, 10%. We did have 10% for transportation. We used the current figures in the CADA contract as far as what the one that is currently operational through the end of June. Just trying to use those historical averages. And at the time, we used all existing staff. We did have through over the course of that time, between February 24th and then March 17th, we accounted for retirements that were happening that were known within our staff. Some of those retirements occurred both on the professional side and the support staff side. We did account for an unfilled, potentially one teaching position. I did try to list where that was in the projection, but there's a couple different opportunities that we'll discuss tonight. The one directly related was looking at ESL, looking at kind of changing the way our ESL program runs, becoming a one teacher with additional supports. We have through retirements looking at combining the transportation and food services position, like some of our neighboring districts do, again, through retirement opportunities. We did get notified by Pennsylvania Department of Ed that our transportation subsidy in the 23-24 school year, which we receive as revenue for the 25-26 school year, was increased by $150,000. Honestly, we found some variation in that to be somewhat unpredictable 2 years out at times, but it's definitely a benefit to our budget to receive that notification from PDE. Very small looking at ed software. We use STAR in many of our classes, but at the secondary level, looking to transition from STAR to Firefly, which is a state offered program to still maintain STAR in the elementary schools. And then we had, I talked about that as well, looking at the replacements to support staff retirements. That is what brought down that deficit number. Again, still using all of the assumptions from the top down to the 1,449,000 that went into that 10% number. Because if you recall, we were talking more 12%, initially in February 24th. So I wanted to make sure that those were the changes that those were the changes reflected from February 24th through March 17th. So potential paths forward, I think this is important to highlight, because again, the timelines are really tricky, is that, right now what we know is there's a referendum. That language will be on the ballots on May 20th, no matter what happens from here until then. There is no way to remove it. So we essentially have two paths that must occur at the same time, right? There is the referendum path, pardon me, if the voters were to choose to pass a referendum, we will have a budget that includes exactly that 10.629%. And if it fails, I kind of listed them as three options, but those are really just, it really is anywhere amongst that continuum potentially, of the 5.01, expecting the PD exception to be an option, expecting to hear that soon, the 4%, and then anything less than 4%. It's really anywhere within the range. The way the referendum works is that the number on the referendum has to be exactly, what the budget would be. Everything else is within that range. Just kind of wanted to list them out, and that's how I plan to talk about them here this evening, knowing that everything between 5.01 and 0 is really, the options are 10.62 and everything that fits between 5.01 and 0 in theory, just knowing that those are the two paths. So the first thing that we will discuss then is looking at that 5.10 without any of kind of the large unknown changes out there, and we'll kind of walk ourselves through there. So looking at, oh, pardon me, put this back in here. This is a slide that we return just about every time to understand what a % increase generates in revenue and what it does to our mill rate. We changed, this would be identical to a slide that was in the previous presentation, except we changed the % increase related to the referendum from the 12% number to the 10% number. So you looking at those key places, again, I think important ones to look at, that 10.629 is 2.3 million. The 5.01 is a little over $1 million. 4% generates projected 874,000. 1%, it's a good number to just have because it helps you kind of keep track and marker what different changes would be. It could be anything in between there. A 1% equals 218,000, which is what we're projecting. It just kind of helps to keep organized if you remember 1% is. Again, next we go to that 5.01 as like the idea, but these are really items that we'll need to discuss as a board. So here are our kind of tracking list from the 5.01. Remember the assumption in the 1.9, which was our starting point, that then went down to 1.4, was the 4%. So when we say 5.01 increase, that really only represents another 222,000 because 4 was already built in. So this is just the addition to the PDE exception. And you can see your running list on the right side as we look at ways to drop that down closer to 0. So we have some positions. We will have a vacant high school science position that we would not replace through kind of initial scheduling. Through the request to the high school, we would be able to work with that number. We do have a position looking at, say, the middle school library and looking at condensing the library program that way. Again, you can see your countdown. When you look at the numbers in the middle, they're not round because they take into account a variety of things. There's PSERS cost, then we get PSERS subsidy. So sometimes the numbers might look much different than you might think in terms of how they are represented within the budget. We do have on that consideration looking at one administration position potentially as the director of curriculum position. We have the 4 sections of 3rd grade. So that would be now the 3rd grade level within our elementaries where we would only have 4 instead of 5 potentially. Currently in 2nd grade, we would have an average of 24 students. What would be required to move students between buildings? It really works either way. That would be a decision we would look based on transportation, but we still have a class average of the current enrollment of 24 students in 3rd grade. Potentially, we would look district-wide and look at reducing 4 part-time instructional aides. That's something that the administration team would come together and kind of determine where that would go. We believe that's through attrition. We typically have between regular ed and special ed vacancies over the course of that time where we would need to identify where the best places for that are. And then we have a small number there. We put this out in discussion last year as a part of the budget process. Pay to participate in athletics, we're looking at about $100 per participant in secondary, would generate just about $22,000. I have a slash there because there also could be an alternate model where we would, if the board wanted us to, we could identify a way to kind of replicate that revenue through facility usage. Currently, we receive very little money for facility usage because any group within or that serves students, residents within the district, do not charge a facility usage fee. So we looked at that as potentially an either or opportunity, where I think we would be able to create a model where we could generate $22,000 worth of revenue from the facility usage versus the pay to participate. I think largely when you look at what that is, it's kind of shifts, your pay to participate is mostly impacting secondary students participating in their activities, where I think if you shift to the other side, it's organizations that typically were more support younger students in the district, but it's all the same families within the district. Again, if you see that asterisk at the bottom says does not require any furloughing in individuals within this chart. This is a key factor that we must consider. So there's obviously some movement that would be required, but would not require any furloughing of current staff. The next slide is what we're calling the major unknowns. Those major unknowns are currently unsettled agreements. We have two, which include our CADA agreement and transportation, lumped all together, where the unknown factors of those two collectively that we are looking at. Well, from our projections, we have them account for $618,000 when we lump those two together of our unknown, currently unsettled agreements. The other major unknown is that cyber charter reform that we talked about. The current governor's proposal is to set a base rate of $8,000 per student. That $8,000 would be for a regular ed student. How special education would be handled is sort of vague at the time of the proposal. But if we took our current cyber charter, the numbers I used to come up with, that 521 is actually at $10,000 of a base, not 8,000, because everything we hear is that some negotiation is certainly going to take place, even though there is some optimism after many, many years that there could be a change at the legislative, from a legislative standpoint in Harrisburg related to how cyber charter schools are funded. Again, this is only our cyber charter component. It wouldn't impact the students in their education, just the way the schools are funded, because currently any student that resides within our district and goes to a charter, there's a calculation of $18,000 for regular ed, $36,000 for special education that comes from the district's budget. Represents about $2 million annually. The total, it's just about 50-50. You can say about $1 million for cyber charter, about $1 million for brick and mortar. And if our current enrollment remained the same in the cyber and the base rate was set at 10,000, we would say that my projection is $521,000 annually. So major unknowns. That's dependent upon legislature. My hope would be that if that doesn't happen, that some money would be put back into that transition fund that funded us last year with $107,000, nowhere near the 521. But let's see, there would be optimism for that. Those are, and the way we put, the way we calculate those are like maximum values, as we're calling it. There'll be a maximum and minimums depending on everything from that maximum cost, to theoretically zero as possible within those unknown changes. So just kind of to summarize, when we look at this, Act 1 PDE exception, you'll see the terminology there, that maximum standing difference, which is if everything went in the favor of the Kutztown Area School District budget, right? Just in that inanimate object, if everything went in its favor over the course of that time, in addition to all of the potential changes that were listed on that previous slide, which the sum of that was 770,000. You're then taking, that would represent a $460,000 surplus in budget. That's if all of those things, if those unknowns were not 618,000, they were zero, which is highly unlikely, right? And if all of the other changes that were referenced in that previous slide were reduced from the budget. There's one, the 5.01 is actually additional revenue, while the others are reduced expenses. But for the purpose of this exercise, we count down from the deficit, so it all looks either like a reduced expenditure or revenue. We just make it all look the same for the purpose of counting down. So again, the original number was based off of a 4% tax increase and then all of the other assumptions. So this is kind of going backwards in a sense, but the conversation here at the board level has been, let's talk about the referendum side, which is the high end, and what that would include would be not needing to do any of the things on that first 5.01 slide, right? And then, well, we should be talking about the whole range, which goes down to zero. Well, the 4% tax increase was already built into that $1.9 million deficit that we had referenced from February meeting. So we took the March 17th bottom line, but made the tax increase zero. And now you see that number balloon up to 2.8 million. You kind of count down, through all those things on the 5% slide, and you as you can see, you only get down to 2.2 million here. Then continuing to count, we have the major unknowns. You see if the minimum standing difference with, again, they all went in the favor of the inanimate object that is the Cook Center School District budget. You're still looking with the 0% tax increase if all those things went in that favor at a $1.1 million deficit. So then what do you do from there, right? It's this, again, as I said, there's so many variables that it felt like structuring this might be a little bit difficult to follow, and I hope that line of logic has kind of landed so far. So the next is, what do you do with 0% and that minimum standing difference of zero? We kind of went through every possible scenario in every potential that we could look at initially. And if we went down, as we talk about all the time, the majority of our costs are in personnel. If we looked at 6 additional teaching positions and 1 additional administration position, you're looking at $700,000 more. So based off of that countdown under a 0% tax increase, we still would have a $418,000 deficit. And that's if everything else went in favor of the budget using personified.
The chat.
Yes.
If you go back to your 5%, the final slide. One after that, slide after that.
Probably one more here.
All right, so with this slide at 5%, we're showing a $460,000 surplus if everything else broke our way, right? Is that correct?
Correct.
So if we take the 5% away at $220,000 percent, basically what you showed earlier.
Correct.
That would be roughly 1.1 million difference in revenue. So we should show a deficit of roughly around 640,000 on a 0% instead of over $1 million. If my math is correct.
But so that's probably an illusion of the way we did this, because remember the 4% was baked in. So this was just 1% added. 4 was already into it.
I understand that, but the end result is in that final number of 460,000 is built in 5% total.
Correct.
So if you added that 5% back in, which is 220,000 times 5, that would be 1.1 million. That would show us having a deficit of $640,000, not $1.1 million. at a 0% tax increase. I guess I'm not sure that the math on the zero adds up. to What you're showing. At the 5%, you have $1
Yep.
million in revenue, so the difference should be $1 million less than $460,000 with zero. Would be 540, 640, somewhere in that range.
So, yeah, so what we're seeing, I think, is that the deficit from the original has actually went back to the February 24th, right, and not to the March 17th. When we started here, so I think you are correct in that in the 2.8. That still doesn't work out perfectly, right? So,
I mean, maybe you need to go back and reevaluate these numbers, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's simple math is 220 times 5 is 1.1 million, so that should be the difference between a 5.0% increase and a zero. At the bottom.
yeah, that makes perfect sense. I'm trying to figure out where the calculation error would come in. It's difficult to do that, right? Yeah, it's kind of like a five. Calculators come up with something different.
I mean, the reason that's important is the very last slide that we showed,
Sure.
is how many additional teachers you would have to put in to close the gap.
Yep.
That would be significantly different. That number started at 600,000 as opposed to over 1 million.
Oh, for sure. Yep. Yeah, that's what I was believing that was likely true, as it is the difference between, so when we reran the 0%, it was based off the February 24th number and not the March 17th number. You're right, so the difference of it should be. Essentially $500,000. Yep.
Yeah, which would bring that minimum standing difference at 0 to 627.
Yeah.
Instead of 150.
Which is a mix of, and that's, again, I apologize for that, the idea of the 0% and kind kind of maximum minimum values. Put us into going back to sort of what was the original status quo, we'd say, and the status quo. The number is actually somewhere in between those two numbers. Because we did account for things that we know, like the transportation and retirement replacement salaries, but there was a few kind of changes in there as well. So it actually would be, if it was true status quo, it would be a little bit higher than that, $500,000 different number.
Well, just think you need to probably set the record straight at least.
What number should we have represented there in the minimum standard difference? And then calculate all the way through. So this would be the perfect place to change. We kind of to add kind of context to that, where the difference is not exactly the full number, because if we were starting back to an original status quo, there are a few here. The retirement replacements would, that would still come off the 1.9, the 99 would not. The theory of the 36 would not, the 150 would. Depending on how we want to look at status quo, whether the other numbers would as well. But it makes more sense to start from the March 17th number, as you pointed out. With a kind of general sense where those numbers are going to be once they're like finalized calculated. Are there other questions about kind of the theory that goes into it?
Maybe just one other question.
Sure.
In light of the fact that there was recently a meeting about the Greenwich Elementary thing, I just want to clarify that this budget does not have any factors of that school decision in it, correct?
That's true, with one exception that I just want. There's no direct factors, but when we talk about sequential schools and the efficiency of staffing, every time we do we collapse to those 4 sections in one of those grade levels, it essentially is using some of those savings from staffing in each of the last 2 years we've done it. It's the 3rd year where we're talking about it. So, when I've discussed Greenwich conversation, it's those numbers are going back to the 23-24 budget. And this would be 3 positions down from the spot if everything here happened, but that's through the efficiency of the sequential schools model of just being able to, in some areas, increase class sizes, but then having to do staffing as a result of that. What we've done is we count that as send students one way or the other. So that's the only component, but no decision making related to it, just those figures.
Yeah, it's not factored into this specific budget.
No.
And if anything, as we streamline, it reduces the amount of savings that we might experience if we did.
That is actually, yes. Yep.
Thank you.
That,
Yes.
as we look at the percentage of tax increases, I think it would be helpful for people to know millage. I didn't know millage before I sat here. And when I'm looking at the millage numbers, we're talking, if you want to go to the next slide. The 3% increase would put us at 31.93. It'd be really helpful too to compare our neighboring districts. Fleetwood is already at a 34.6. So it just really puts it different light for people to see that.
Yeah, for sure. I could pull up a slide from last year's that gives you, the previous millage by districts. Just give me one
Well,
moment.
that's the one I have.
Oh, so you have it pulled up.
Yeah,
Okay.
and, looking at it, we're, what, 30, what's down?
We're at 31.
31.00.
Correct.
And Fleetwood right now is at 34.61.
Yeah.
So even if we raise taxes by 10%, our millage is still lower than Fleetwood.
Yeah, many districts have historically continued small increases where we took that,
Yeah.
9-year gap from that. So their millage rates continue to go up, where ours stay the same.
Yeah.
So it takes a long time to get back.
But what I mean,
Raised
it's just
without-
really helpful
Yes.
for people to see that.
Mhm.
That if we do decide to raise taxes, it's like, listen, we're still are lower.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll add that, we can add that as a question onto this before we publicly post it. From the board, any other questions, comments?
I know, like for the presentation tonight, you kind of have to be very general in what you say. If at the next meeting, they're asking for, when I say they, like us.
Right.
The board would be asking for specifics. Would that be the point where you would say what positions might have the least amount of impact?
Yeah, beyond the ones we've already shared here tonight,
Right.
yeah, yeah, we would, we've cut positions every year for the last few years, and if we even looked at just what was presented tonight, not in that vague sense on the last slide, we're down 10 positions in teaching positions since 2022. The admin gets a little bit tricky because we've cut like parts of positions. So we've significantly been reducing year after year after year, with the exception of the 2021 year, we jumped back up a little bit. We're operating another school essentially remote. But yeah, we would, if that's, obviously did not put that in there for very specific reasons, because they're not anything in the realm of what we would be recommending. But if we have to make recommendations, that's what we do.
Just one other comment. I know you shared a slide, I don't know if it was you or one of the presenters in one of our previous meetings, that our high point enrollment was near 1,900, I believe.
Yeah.
And now we currently are at 1,300. So
Yep.
I know that we've made some cuts in recent years, but in many of the years prior, maybe weren't acting as prudently as we were declining our enrollment.
Yeah, there was, in the first, we say 9 years without a tax increase. In the first few years, it made complete sense because there was a decline in enrollment and there was a need for that. And then the last few years, I was here for most of them, and many were, many weren't. In any given year, it made perfect sense. Whether it was the 2021 budget where we were budgeting from home and really had no idea what revenues or expenses were going to look like at all. In the 21-22 budget, we were the beneficiaries of millions of dollars of federal funding, and with really with not great economic conditions and not a lot of understanding of what was happening in each individual home, it was the board made the decision, and it made perfect sense at the time to not increase taxes and use federal funding to continue to operate our schools in that sense. The following year was kind of the same. We still had leftover federal funding, and it was a decision to continue to use that in the budget. Now we start trickling down into the last 2 years, and it just became more and more challenging. Again, you can also see that timeline of looking back from 2014-15, reducing staffing because enrollment. However, the last 9 years, our enrollment is essentially flat, give or take 1-2% on any year. It's essentially flat, but since 2022, we still continue to cut staff, annually, for the purpose of being able to meet our budgetary needs while still serving.
I guess I would just look at it slightly differently, that if we had a high point of 1,900 and we waited until the last few years to start reducing our staff, we were just not right-sized for a long time. And so, although it's very painful to make these cuts now, if they had been done when the enrollment started to decline, it would have been a lot easier to handle.
I think that's fair. It goes back, we're going back before any of us were involved here. No. Any questions, comments from our public? Mr. Hopper?
Mr. Eustace, at one time we had 144 teachers. 15 years ago, we lost 13 in one fell swoop. We've continued to reduce teaching staff since then, sometimes through attrition, but when you reduce a position, you're hurting students. You know, you're increasing class sizes, you're offering fewer programs. You're doing everything that you say you don't want to do, but you're doing.
I guess I would just say that I don't know the numbers from that far ago about the number of teachers and how many we chose to reduce. But there is a ratio, so if the number of students is declining, hypothetically, the number of teachers and administrators we should also be declining. I don't know that there have been programs eliminated along the way. I have not heard much about that, so I think something.
Yeah, I mean, in recent years, we've really been cutting around the edges, I would say, in terms of trying to not eliminate programs, but program, define it how you will, like if you have one less teacher in an area, you might be able to offer one selected. That's not a full program, but it might be certain classes that we can't offer. We've definitely increased class sizes in the last few years. Our 10 plus years ago, our staff to student ratio, we had more staff per student than just about anybody else. So the last years, we're in a very, I would say, competitive space from a staff to student ratio. We are not, for schools our size always have, typically some more staff per students because it's not as efficient as staff when you have singleton positions, etc. But we've put ourselves to a very competitive place in terms of districts our size. Again, we could pull out all those ranks. We've done that in previous years. But you've seen us go from way more staff per student to, ranked probably in districts our size in the immediate area, amongst the middle. So,
Christian, could you go back to your slide that showed a $440,000 surplus, please, with the 5% just that you were using there? Yep. $460,000 surplus. So it looks like there is a path to not have to continue to cut teaching staff. That's been shown this evening, not even when meeting a 5.01 if everything goes right. But I find interesting about, we also have the option for a referendum. And if you go back to when prior boards made the decision to become a more efficient school district, and if you, and taxes stop being raised, if you would add 1% tax increase, you would find that you're going to be very similar in millage to what the current referendum of 10.63 provides. It's going to be very similar. So the community, I think this year is going to get to weigh in on whether they agree with that decade of becoming more efficient, or if they want, or if they would have preferred to see steady increases for the last decade. And even without, there is a path without a large tax increase this year and without the referendum to have a surplus without making deep cuts, as Christian's referring to.
yeah, I mean, over that time, records where small tax increases over that time, would have landed us in a very similar place from a millage standpoint. What we've done in that meantime has used some fund balance. I mean, there's no doubt we've used fund balance in, in recent years. And that was a known part of, that planning as well. And we saw some years where costs were higher than what, again, we talked about a budgeting cycle. We're projecting costs for May of 25 and May of 24, and we just know how those costs do vary sometimes, depending on what's happening from an inflationary standpoint, whatever the economic conditions are a year later. We've been very, very good with projecting within, 1, 2, or 3%. But when you're budgeting on such a tight string, there are times where it goes, sometimes went in our favor, more often than not, in the last few years, it did not.
I think one point I just want to make that if we want to be able to run the school district with some consistency, we have to get past trying to just think about the current budget and only doing whatever we need to possibly do this year, whether it be cuts or tax increase or a combination of the both, to get through a single year's budget. We have to start looking at what this budget is going to do, whether we increase taxes, we don't increase taxes, how that's going to affect next year's budget and the year's budget after that. So if we just try to get by on, by the skin of our teeth, or do what we did last year where we got by with $1 million deficit, we're going to be in this boat every single year for the next foreseeable number of years.
That essentially ends up being the argument on the side of annual small increase, right? Because then you can project it a little bit more. Where we haven't, then we are dependent on assessed value. We're dependent on other factors we can't control, like state funding. We're dependent on hoping that legislative changes happen to, that's the result of us not doing that. Again, those are two sides of, I think, very reasonable and valid arguments, that have happened repeatedly over time that budget season here, right? Is that the safety of the long-term safety of planning it out that way versus running a budget based on what we need right now, right? And that's going back to, when I started here, those were the dialogue and debates that were happening at that time. And they're really just tried and true kind of philosophy of school district. And in recent years, we've done, what do we need to do right now? And just makes it challenging.
I mean, if we think about what we have to do as a district, just in terms of our buildings and maintenance, regardless of what we decide to do with the different buildings that we have to keep them updated. We have to put money into those buildings. If we had, I guess what I'm trying to say is that having a net positive income at the end of the year isn't a terrible thing. That means that's money that we can put into capital to put towards keeping our buildings running. Or less money that we might have to do, run up for bond issuance. So, the zero looks nice because it means that we're, at least from a budget standpoint, we're balanced. But any one thing could push that budget to, in the black or in the red if we're always at a zero, or how we have been doing the past few years, being in the red for the budget. So I think this slide is slightly misleading because it's just saying if everything goes in our favor.
Yeah.
And that just isn't a likely outcome.
Yeah, and that's where we go with the maximum standing, right, it's not intentionally misleading, but it's the
right.
Uber optimistic versus, that we just need to know what those ranges are, of extreme optimism versus the pessimistic. And again, that's assigning kind of feeling a budget that isn't about individual people's feelings, and it's about the budget.
Good time for like a 5-minute break.
Of course. All right, okay, take a 5-minute recess.
5-minute recess. I assume they just don't watch us walk around. Yeah.
Don't know more.
call back to order.
All right, we're back to order. Any other questions from our public? No other questions from the public? Any other? We have to ask at least one question or comment or the whole. Anyone online, Dr. Myers?
No.
Speak to a couple of comments.
Okay.
There were two particular areas that I wanted to mention some of my concerns over this evening. I wanted to start by really recognizing the incredible work that our teachers do for our district. We consistently rank among the top in the county, and that's a direct reflection of their dedication and expertise. And I certainly share, and I know many folks share that they deserve our respect, appreciation, and gratitude. Some of the recent accolades earned by I will say students and teachers, because again, I think it's a shared partnership there.
Parents and communities.
And as well. In Berks County Keystone High School, we ranked first in literature in the county, second in algebra, and first in biology at the high school level. In the middle school, in the PSSAs, out of 24 middle schools, we ranked first in ELA in 6th grade, 7th grade, and we ranked fourth in 6th grade in mathematics, just as some examples. Then at the elementary level in PSSAs, again, at grade 3, we saw KDS ranking second in 3rd grade for ELA and ranking first in 3rd grade for mathematics. So again, the numbers do occasionally vary by grade, but we are consistently at the top.
They vary, but we are always in the
Always at the top.
range.
So I am concerned about some of the criticism that I've heard in previous board meetings, and that I've frankly seen online of late as well. The idea that teachers are wealthy or taking too much is simply not grounded in reality or fair. I decided to check out the job boards here in Kutztown today. And when looking at jobs that require a high school education, I found a couple of the following. A clerk working at Rudders in Kutztown earns about $18 an hour, which is an annual salary of $37,000. A warehouse associate at Bimbo Bakeries in Albertus would be earning $23.85 to start, which reflects an annual salary of $49,608. If you want to drive a little bit further and have a different background, a dental assistant in Bethlehem could make $38 starting, which is an annual salary of $79,040. We certainly know that there are other local companies, East Penn, DECA, Sheets, Amazon, who are all offering competitive ranges that are somewhere within those ranges of what I referenced. So I wanted to really put some of the teachers' pay scale here in Kutztown into some of those similar terms, because I do think it's sometimes hard to take what is the starting salary for a bachelor's degree teacher who's coming into the district with no experience. They'll be coming in at $54,509, which is the equivalent of a $26 an hour pay. And obviously all of our teachers are required to have a 4-year education, college degree, and have invested in their time and education to be able to bring to bear a level of expertise in the classroom. If that same teacher sticks with us for 14 years, which, that's a great tenure, would love to see teachers stick with us that long, their hourly salary or hourly rate would go from $26 an hour to $34.80. That's what a $72,000 salary is that is in our current CADA contract for a bachelor's step 14. If we look at someone who has a master's degree, they are starting at $32.80. And that they are going to go up to about, $87,000 a year in a salary, which is the equivalent of in the low 40s. And then it is true that we do have, I believe, is it around 17 people within the district who are making the top of the pay scale, which does take you up to 110,727. So those individuals are up around $53 an hour. These are individuals who have achieved the equivalent of a doctorate degree. And rather than then going outside to work in an alternative way, they are bringing their passion to bear and working in a length of tenure of 14 years or more here in our school district to serve our students. So at that 110,000, you know, I also want to keep that in mind because there were a lot of numbers thrown around in previous meetings about how that compares to other schools within the county. I'm really not too interested in comparing how we compare to other schools in the county that might be a small town 30 miles away, you know, 45-minute drive. I'd rather look at two of the schools that are right here bordering us. If you just take one step off of Premise Made, you'll be in the Parkland Area School District. In their starting salary for a teacher is $63,000 a year. So that's compared to our 54,000. So all a teacher, if they're living in this area, they want to find a job, take one step further out of this district, and they can get a $9,000 pay bump. When we look at the top of the range for Parkland, they are sitting at $112,000, which again, you know, that certainly is an excellent salary. But also, when we look at other options that many folks, many teachers and people who have doctorate degrees or even just bachelor's have, is 35% of the US workforce right now is participating in remote work. Corporate salaries for a trainer, a corporate trainer in a global multinational corporation easily start at $100,000. So I am very grateful every day that our teachers choose to work with our students, to choose to come into the classroom, deal with the whole range and gamut of behavioral issues, of iPhone addiction, of all of the hard work involved in nurturing and guiding young children to become the best that they can be. I also wanted to reference that Northwestern Lehigh, which is another school in Lehigh County that borders us, starts at 55,889, just slightly above where we're at as well. So again, I reject this idea that our teachers are wealthy. Our teachers are appropriately compensated for the work that they are doing with our students, recognizing the tenure that they are putting in, their expertise and their advanced schooling, you know, to earn not only a bachelor's, but also earn a master's, and then continue on to 60 additional credits beyond a master's is a significant amount of time and energy and effort that teachers have spent to better themselves and to hone their craft and to bring that to bear for our students, which I sincerely respect and value. So I am concerned that, again, having any conversation that is not treating teaching as the noble profession that it is, with a respect for the myriad of options that they have to do something other than come in and teach our students every day. Again, I'm concerned, and I encourage us to treat our teachers with the respect that they have earned. Whether it is coming in early, after hours grading, attending school concerts, right? They consistently show up for us here at Kutztown, and I'm very grateful. The other area that I'd like to discuss is the ease with which we talk about teachers' cuts. It is staggering to me when we talk about the fact that we have gone in 2018 from 126 full-time teachers supporting our students to today having 117, and we already are talking about easily 3 or 4 additional teacher cuts. So we're bringing us potentially down 12 or 13 positions from right before the pandemic. And again, the enrollment rates that we're looking at have been consistent between that time and today. And that is directly impacting when we talk about larger class sizes. And when we talk about our students not getting the attention and support that they need, when we talk about concerns over bullying and not having, again, the hands-on attention in the classroom, that is all a byproduct of trying to take 12 teachers out of our school system who are not there to support our students. So I am concerned that it becomes a bit of a relaxed, oh, we'll just get a couple more teachers. You know, we already are facing a situation where social studies teachers, we only have 3 in the high school, I believe. You know, we're talking about going down to only 3 science teachers in the high school. And of course, with each cut that is made, that is putting additional burden on the teachers who then in the next breath, people are saying, oh, are wealthy and overpaid. So I don't take it lightly when thinking about cutting teachers. I am strongly against cutting teachers further from our school district. And, you know, whether the referendum passes or not, again, I do know from the consistent conversations that I hear and what we hear every month at board meetings that people don't want larger class sizes for their students. So it is our responsibility as a community to be funding the education that we want our students to receive at the appropriate financial levels that are required in order to deliver that. So if we want to keep seeing our schools at the top of the list, first, second, fifth, et cetera, we need to make sure that the teachers are supported and that we are providing a learning environment with appropriate teacher ratios that allows students to thrive. And our responsibility here as board members is first and foremost to our students. Full stop. It is not to the taxpayers who are a portion of the folks who have voted us in. I certainly respect our taxpayers and I want to be thoughtful and considerate and financially responsible, but our primary responsibility is to our students. And so I really encourage us as we continue moving forward in the discussions, let's look at the realistic scenarios. I mean, I've never seen a perfect everything falls our way scenario, right? So again, we know that's not going to happen. But I do think that we need to be looking at an appropriate tax increase to help make up for those 9 years of no tax increases, because I do not take it lightly to talk about cutting teachers. And I do not think that it is the responsibility of our teachers to be having their own personal budgets squeezed because we as a community are not willing to support the excellent work and the excellence that they have brought into the classroom every day. That is our responsibility to fund it appropriately, not provide a confrontational and negative work environment. I want them coming in, giving their very best to our students to be energized and jazzed and continue to really deliver the excellence that we've seen. Thank you.
Thank you. We have incredible teachers, Christina, there's no question about that. We have a meeting today with 4 new student teachers who come in 2 times a year, and that's one of the conversations we have is, well, where did you go to school? Where do you come from? You know, where have you been? And kind of your observations and the discussion is you're going to be in Christina, you're going to see the best and have a great opportunity to learn. We truly believe that. I just want to correct one thing. We still have 4 science teachers, not 3. We would, and 1 teaches some math sometimes, and then we have another teacher who does science. It gets a little gray, but we still would have 4 in the department. This would be a traditional 30 more in science because of the varied levels of science.
Any other board comments? Mr. Wilson?
Um, a lot of those thoughts I would absolutely echo, and as a teacher myself, I think I would just be the one to just say that it's a challenging job, no doubt. It's a service job, no doubt. So when we speak about the salaries of teachers, I think what is often very challenging about this is when we're making these difficult decisions, that they can often be misconstrued as devaluing of the teacher. And I think that when that message becomes one that's trying to be promoted, when somebody is just trying to say, hey, here's the state, here's the budget, here's the numbers, here's reality. And then when that conversation is pointed to or turns into the intent to be insulting, I think it's understandable, and sometimes it becomes an unfortunate byproduct. So I definitely want to just make clear that any comments here or any discussions that are being had are, as far as I'm aware, from the perspective of making these challenging questions. Everybody's allowed to have their opinion. Laurel, I would just caution you when you're selecting data. If you're looking at Parkland, I just did a quick research, US News report, the school of 9,833 students versus Kutztown. And again, just keeping off the same 1,355 students. Parkland has 9 elementary school buildings. So it's when we're selecting data, I would always prefer to look at that data. All of the data that we're going to be discussing is going to be things that reflect budget-wise. All teacher salaries are something that's always been known. A simple internet search can look it up. So we can see all of these numbers, and I think it's just something that's challenging that we're going to have to work through. But at the state where we're at, I think it would, in my opinion, be best to reference, like we do with everything when it comes to when we're comparing education and standards. And we look at the schools that are locally, and there's a reason why we do those things. So I think as these discussions continue, I think the point of, I'm not aware of any of the conversations that are happening online or anything like that. But I hope all of those conversations are focusing on and can focus on the reality of the compensation, how they compare to other schools. And the numbers are very clear in that when you're looking at a school of 10,000 versus 1,000, it's a different tax base and it's a different scenario. It has nothing to do. I'm very proud of the quality teachers that we have here. So it's a conversation that's very real. It has to be, we have to find a solution for this. And where we stand right now, we're at the top range in all of Berks County, and it's just something that it's a reality. It needs to be addressed, and there's nothing against the quality of our teachers.
So I was referencing directly from the Parkland School District teachers contract. I will share that out with all of the board members afterwards. You are correct. They do have more enrollment and they do have a larger tax base than we do. So I'm not trying to make any commentary on that. What I'm looking at is specifically what their 24-25 teacher matrix looks like for salaries. I guess further, it's a great point. We can talk about not wanting to devalue teachers. But the truth is we fund what it is that we value. And that is obvious in anyone's personal home budget. That's obvious in a school district or in a federal government. We fund what it is that we value the most. And so if the first thing that we are always doing is saying, you know what, let's not look at tax increase, let's just look at cutting more teachers. That is a direct statement from my view on what it is that we value. So that is not what I value our teachers. I want to keep our current teaching staff level and staff whole. And I don't want to have yet another year of continued cutting of teachers.
I'm sorry. Just one quick comment slash question. Could you explain, what it means if we are approved for the special education, subsidy, or not subsidy, sorry, exception, yeah.
What does it mean? Why are we being approved?
Yeah, like what did we have to hit to be able to say yes?
Yeah, it's not a very clear number, but what it does is it accounts for how much you spend on special education versus what is funded through federal and state resources, which is very, very small. You know, so we spend, every district spends way more, like 80% more on special education than is actually funded. So those numbers are calculated at the state level, and then you can be eligible for an exception. So without very specific numbers, that's all it is. That we spend much more than is funded, even though it is, you know, technically a federal mandate.
Okay, I guess, so then my point is just to kind of plant the seed of, if that is an exception that we are granted, I really think it behooves us to seriously consider accepting that, because it just means that we have those higher percentages and higher costs of special education students. And instead of trying to fund that out of our existing tax structure, it gives us that little extra flexibility to say, hey, you know, we understand that you have that higher percentage, and it grants us the ability to properly fund those instead of taking that funding away from the general, like, tax increase that we would be allowed to get. So I just say, if the exception is there, I really think we need to strongly consider taking that exception.
And I just want to reiterate something from the beginning, is that revenue is a challenge, right? And that's, you know, when we look at our budget annually, there's revenue on the expense side. And I think to speak to Mrs. Ziegler's point, I think it's fair to say that how casually, you know, we're going to talk about cutting expenses, because in this moment, we have so much more control over it. I think, you know, and that's just become the norm in our budget conversations. That's not really a commentary, it's just fact. You know, where revenue, again, we have limitations through Act 1 to what the board can do, but we also have the limitations of overall assessed value, which is crushing us right now, you know, and that's where, if you go across the state, you look at all the different types of school districts, you have those that are seeing massive increases in assessed value, and whether they raise taxes or not, they're seeing that their revenue increases enough to, you know, cover those increased costs. You have some that are struggling as much as us, or even more in some instances, and then you have different districts that are more kind of urban centers that have a completely different funding model, where you see more state funding and less local funding. But it's really clear when you start going district by district, you can paint a picture of what the development is like in the area. And I don't even know, that's not an advocacy for development, it's just funding system is kind of unfair to a lot of communities like ours, is the reality of it. And to see us in a year, we talked every year I've been here as superintendent, outside of being that first one where we had no idea what was going on. We've talked about challenging budgets. This is the first time that we're saying there's a real possibility that we have less state funding and less local funding if we, you know, without increasing taxes. That's pretty remarkable in a bad, right? That's very, very real and possible. You know, and that's while we have state government that's putting more money into education than almost ever before, but it's still not coming here to communities and towns. And you know, that comes down to some calculations that they have in terms of how they identify where that money should go. We are deemed by Pennsylvania as a community that can fund education. I think that's based on a system before costs became so much really. Where we're seeing increased costs in all areas. So, you know, that's not That's just, I think there's facts, that are reality here in our community, so, revenue stream is a challenge for us.
Yeah, let's be, I mean, privately and publicly, I think the conversations have not been on how to cut teachers this year. In fact, it's been how to keep those positions within the district, not cut them. So I think it's, some of the comments that have been made, I think it's very valuable to know that we've been searching high and low for ways to keep as many positions that can fit in the budget, including a referendum on the ballot.
I just have to comment, someone who's been on both sides of the academic and corporate. To hear taxpayers are not a primary stakeholder in these challenges that we're trying to deal with here in financing the service. That's very disappointing. Second, with regard to comparing salaries, it's of course the important number is not just the salary. It's the total cost of an employee, including benefits. And we all know that those people whose corporate salaries are being cited are not the beneficiary of defined benefit pension plans these days. Those people are all on their own to finance their retirement. And so you can't just compare salaries. You got to compare total cost of an employee. And it's, again, it's disappointing when taxpayers are not the primary stakeholder at this deal.
And I was going to supplement that a little bit more. This is nobody in this room doing this district's fault, but also states mismanagement at the defined benefit historically. We also pay, we pay our PSERS rate, which, is that plus our FICA accounts about 41%. You get some back, but you can add 20% on top of that because the states, I'm calling it mismanagement years ago of those defined benefit plans. So you're right, the cost of employee is much more than what salary is in a variety of ways that it's just part of our reality and our challenge. And those rising PSERS costs was it 15 years ago now, when they really started to spike, changed school district budgets significantly because you just take anybody's salary in the district, you multiply it by 30% plus, and that's what the actual front end cost is to. That's a huge, huge difference that if nobody here, nobody in this community, nobody who teaches here, who's on the board here had anything to do with it. It's a mandated cost.
And I appreciate, thank you for sharing your perspective. I do certainly value and respect our taxpayers. Our taxpayers also do get the benefit of the appreciation of housing costs in our area over the past how many years. So they certainly are an important stakeholder within the discussion. Just for me personally, the students are my top priority. So I do understand and respect that there are other viewpoints on that. I also on the comparison, yes, schools take on additional costs, and it's not the full cost of a burden of an employee, as well as corporations, in which they are also paying above and beyond that 30–40% for medical costs, as well as things like contributions to 401k plans and other regular benefits that are just part of working, that anyone who has a bachelor's or master's plus 60 credits could go out and look for alternative work in which there are other benefits and burdens provided in addition to the salary by that employer. Thank you for your perspective.
I think one of the comments that we made too was about people that are motivated. Do we have a comparison of like the average household income for residents of Cleveland School District versus it's down? I think you're going to find Fleetwood is closer to $100,000 per year versus Kutztown, which is more like 75. The other thing too is if you look at Kutztown's budget versus Fleetwood's budget, I'm going to guess that Fleetwood's budget is probably about like 1.5 times, maybe almost 2 times as much as ours is. Yeah, but they have more cost.
1.5, I would say, yeah.
I think, is that a good time when we should really be looking at those comparison millage rates? Because again, a millage rate is what it allows us to look at the tax burden that is held by a particular taxpayer based on the value of their home. And I know Leva was mentioning there are many other districts throughout the county that are at a much higher tax millage rate. So I think that might be a good comparison to consider rather than.
But you also have people that, you know, have better ability to afford it in other districts versus possibly districts.
Yeah, I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I think that this is one situation when we're talking about, again, the taxpayer, it's then looking at those millage rates because it's not looking at the overall household income of everyone living within the district. It's looking at that property tax and that millage rate that is applied to a homeowner. So again, that's where I think it's not quite as helpful to look at because the overall household income across the district will take into many non-taxpayers who are renting, et cetera, as well.
I'd just like to maybe state that I think that's a point that I hadn't thought about is the average annual income of the residents in the community. I think that's a big point. Because we do have quite a few residents in this community who are, you know, without children or retired or whatever. And so all of our decisions, although they are made for the benefits of the children in the school, there are also taxpayers who are very concerned. I've had a few phone calls about tax increases because their social security is not going to go up 10% next year, things like that. So I think the annual income is a good factor. I don't know the answer. I've never looked at it. But I would be curious to know. When we're comparing to other school districts, how do we compare financially as individuals?
I'm struggling to find a comparison to village rate, right now that quickly. This is just from last year, so something that's a change in village from 2014 to 2024. You know, we can see, and that's by percent, that's not by mil. But these definitely giving through our comments some good things to include in the next presentation, related to comparative village rates. I think the average income is important as well. So we'll pull all that together and make sure we include that in the next presentation that we have. We just know that by percentage, you know, this was kind of change over 10 years, while we only had one increase at that time. This is not active today, it's prior to 24-25 school year. And you know, as I said, revenues kind of came in this conversation, you know, until the Hawk we see that one negative because of the massive increase in revenue for assessed value. So,
Just so that I know that I'm reading this correctly. So we're saying if you had a home in Boyertown over the last 10 years, your taxes would have gone up 36.8%. And
cumulatively, yes.
cumulatively, and in Fleetwood, they would have gone up 16.78%. But here in Kutztown, they have only gone up 2.4%.
That is before 24-25. Yeah,
Correct.
that would be correct.
Okay. Thank you.
If there are no more comments or questions, again, sure.
Can we talk about it in the Greenwich, about the, I think it's a cyber schools?
Yep.
Is there, are we able to look into why we have like 50 students?
We contact all the individuals and, you know, we get some answers from some of them. Many, I mean, when someone changes to a cyber charter during the school year and we know about it, it didn't happen several years ago. We do know the story. You know, we always know that story, and the story varies, you know, greatly by each individual student. So I'd have to go through the list. We do keep a list at our virtual academy. Support specialist kind of tracks, continuously contacting those families and asking them for feedback as to either why they originally left or why they might not be interested in coming back to our KBA. And it just does vary greatly, some from not great school experiences, some because they're looking for that flexibility. Many, it's just a choice. Honestly, more than half we don't, or you have families that move in already in a cyber charter as well. And, to them, that's it's not a barrier to moving there, right? I mean, I think a lot of families may think about, hey, might I move or not? The school district area is a really important factor. If you're inside the charter, that's not, because you continue to stay that way. So, I don't think we have great data on it, even though we have anecdotal data that we keep, through our KBA support specialists. I would say about 20% sat 3-4 principals in the room, they can tell you exactly why, because those are recent, in the story. Don't see any other comments, Dr. Myers? I don't think you don't see any more online, or any online, I guess. Switching back to the presentation, just basically say that I'm not going to switch back now, basically say what our next dates are. We do give some budget updates at our regular meetings, on the first or third Monday of the month, which we, in any presentations we have, just as new information arises, we might give a presentation on that. You'll see it reflected somehow on the agenda, typically under the report section, probably in the superintendent's report, if that's going to happen, it comes out the Friday before. We will have our next budget finance committee meeting on the 4th Monday of April, which is 22nd. Taking Dr. Flicker on that, I'm sorry. It's the 28th. I'm just gonna start, not gonna keep mimicking this. So that's right. The 28th, thank you. And we'll also have a meeting in May. Many things will change in between that time, but we'll also include the presentations on the data that's what we're receiving. If you have any questions as a member of the public in the meantime, please don't ever hesitate to give me a call or reach out. It helps us inform what the next presentation is, one, but also, allows for that dialogue. And we will, as you saw, we did the update numbers to Mr. Dish's correction, counting that final scenario of 0% from the 1.4 rather than the $1.9 million deficit. That will be updated and posted on our website. Both under the budget finance committee meeting link under our People's School Board, and also on the agenda for this evening. We'll link it on there, so I'll be updated. No other questions?
Motion to adjourn.